Even if Alberta were to declare independence, it's not as if everything is suddenly a lottery win. Everything is still going to be a hassle, and it's still going to cost money.
If you can't manage your own finances, how will you manage your own autonomy? This is Sydney Fazard for Rebel News here in Calgary, Alberta, for my interview with Kris Sims, the Alberta director from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We spoke at the UCP event that took place recently here in Calgary, named the Courage to Listen Town Hall, sponsored by the UCP, but giving voice to many speakers advocating for Alberta to separate. It's time, they say. And Kris Sims, being the taxpayer expert, decided to give us some insights, especially important when it comes to independence, is how are you going to pay for it all? Where's all the money going to come from? How is the Alberta provincial government going to finance itself into becoming the federal government of Alberta if they can't manage a budget? That's the question we asked Kris Sims in today's interview.
The Taxpayers Federation, we're warning them of, hey, get your own house in order, make sure you have a balanced budget, make sure you are not piling onto the debt, because we're all going to pay for it. We understand why people are upset and frustrated and ready to, divorce the bastard, but we have to understand how much things cost here at home too. So if you want to be strong, you have to make sure you've got a good fortress. And so I recently even wrote an article about Fortress Alberta and why we need to keep our own budgets balanced, why we can't keep going and piling on more and more debt provincially, and why it's super important to be strong here in order to stand up for ourselves. Now, that could be standing up to Ottawa directly, more sovereignty in the sense that we have more control over what happens within our own province, all that good stuff. The main point here is that even if Alberta were to declare independence, it's not as if everything is suddenly a lottery win. Everything is still going to be a hassle, and it's still going to cost money. And so I wanted to focus on provincial finances.
Well, and speaking of provincial finances, if Alberta were to separate and take on a federal government or, transition to being a federal government for the entire province, there are certain costs that would be added to the province's budget. There may be costs that are subtracted, perhaps. Where do you see that the finances falling?
That's a great question. The short answer is we don't know yet. The longer answer is you got to try to look at, say, the health transfer, okay? Like the amount of money that comes from Ottawa to Edmonton for health transfers. You'd have to look at something like national defense. Ottawa spends just under $40 billion-ish as a line item in the budget on national defense. Now, we're the fourth largest province, thereabouts. Would that mean that we would just take that amount and just use the math there? How many jets would we build? I guess you wouldn't really need a Navy. You'd have to consider all these elements. Border security. Where would we set up our borders? How much would that cost? So I think it's important for folks who, understandably so, are totally frustrated and fed up with what's going on in Ottawa to remember the realities of the math and the budgets and the cost. Can we afford things like a national defense program, border security, fully funding our own healthcare system if that's how we want to go? What is all of that going to cost? Pension plan? Will Ottawa force us to take a portion of the national debt? All of that has to be considered. A friend of mine recently likened it to this, and I found it interesting. It's not a perfect example, but it's interesting. When a marriage breaks up and there's a divorce, the highest earning spouse who's been paying all the bills the whole time often keeps paying the bills because the other spouse has become accustomed to a certain lifestyle and there isn't a punishment that is enacted on that person. And then also if you have dependents, how much money are they going to get? Who would decide if Alberta had to pay money to what was then Canada and if we were separate? We don't know. But it sounds complicated, legal, and expensive. And it's really important for Western Canadians because there's lots of folks who are interested in this in Saskatchewan, big parts of BC too. They have to think really soberly about this.
Being the Canadian Taxpayers Federation Alberta director, you're attuned to the provincial spending here. You're attuned to most of the federal spending and some of the municipal spending. Who's to say that if Alberta does separate, that their newfound federal government will be acting any better than Canada's federal government? Sure, it'll be smaller scale, but will it be better?
Great question. I'm super glad you asked that because I'll speak from personal experience. When you like someone who's a leader, okay, or a politician, or you like a certain party, say you're team blue or you're team orange, you have to make sure that you're not putting blinders on. You have to look at what they're actually doing. So for example, right after the now late, lovely Premier Ralph Klein left office, spending skyrocketed in Alberta. It doubled in a decade. It doubled between around 2004, 2006-ish, up to 2015. It went up by 103%. The NDP was not in power then. That was the PC government. They doubled program spending. A lot of people say, oh, they spent like drunken sailors. I had a drunken sailor as my best man at my wedding. Byron was way better with money. So they spent like unrestrained politicians. Just because they were an Alberta government and it was a conservative government back then over those last 10 years, right? Doesn't mean they were good with money. Now, credit where it's due. We're super happy with the current government. They've increased the Taxpayer Protection Act so that we all get to vote if there's suddenly a new tax, right? They've also agreed to keep spending restrained below the rate of inflation plus population growth. They're putting money into the Heritage Savings Account, like all really solid things, but they can't be adding money to the debt. And they added more than $5 billion extra to the debt last time around. We can't be doing that here. We have to be in the black. We have to pay down the debt.
And just so people are cognizant of it, we're talking about, the back end of taxes, right? Once the government gets our money, what are they wasting it on? But to take the step before that, where is most of this, where are most of these taxpayer dollars coming from, notably for Alberta? What are the industries that are driving most of this revenue that the government is harvesting from us? That's
a great question. So that is a good question. So one of the reasons why Alberta generates a lot of income taxes provincially coming into Edmonton, if you picture it like, a treasure pot, okay, is because relatively we earn higher wages, okay? Our income is more than on average $70,000 per person in Alberta. That's actually quite a bit higher than the Canadian average if you start looking into more have-not areas like New Brunswick, et cetera. But in Alberta, it's more than $70,000 per. Why? Well, because of energy, right? We have the energy sector. We have the ag sector. So we have the ag sector, which is always there. It is constant. It is always producing. It's amazing. And then we have the energy sector, which if you work hard, you can make a lot of money. And when you make a lot of money, you pay more income tax. And therefore, that is how the government also takes in more money. It isn't just the royalties. The royalties are one big thing, of course, coming from oil and gas. It is the productive members of society here in Alberta who pay provincial income taxes into that pot.
And last word to you.
I just wanted to encourage people to not be discouraged. So if they're frustrated, if they're one of the 50% of Canadians who are within $200 of not making their minimum bill payments, you aren't alone and people are hearing you. I would encourage them to get out there and join an active group. It doesn't have to be the Taxpayers Federation. It could be a church group. It could be another activist group. And so that way it gives you a sense of agency and community, and it'll keep you strong between elections.
Let us know in the comments, do you think Alberta will make or lose money if they decide to go through with independence? For Rebel News, I'm Sidney Fizzard. DoneGettingScrewed.com is where you have to go if you want to see the latest of our Western independence coverage, reporting on this movement that has gained a lot of momentum following the re-election of the Liberal Party of Canada, led now by Prime Minister Mark Carney. So if you want to see our latest and the rest of my interviews with speakers from that UCP town hall, go to DoneGettingScrewed.com.